AI will not make a bad engineer good. Before we jump into the episode, a quick shout out to our sponsor, KCDC, the Kansas City Developer Conference. If you're a software developer, architect, engineer, or just a tech enthusiast looking to sharpen your skills, this is the conference for you. KCDC brings together hundreds of developers from all over the country for 3 days of incredible sessions, hands-on workshops, and community connection right in the heart of Kansas City. Whether you're into cloud, AI, DevOps, .NET, JavaScript, or just want to hang out with some of the smartest people in tech, there's something for you at KCDC. Tickets are on sale now at kcdc.info, and trust me, you don't want to miss it. Welcome to the next episode of Engineer in the Loop, the podcast for professionals working with models in the mix. This episode, we have Cameron back. Welcome, Cameron. His title has changed slightly. He's now the owner of Small Batch Solutions, and his day job is helping companies tame complexity in tech. How's it going?
Oh, it's going well, Alec. Good to see you again, my friend. And Brian, good to see you as well.
Good to see you.
So, Cameron, I think your role's changed a little bit since we've chatted last, and I think something that's been pretty interesting is at Lean Techniques, we've had a bunch of interns join in. At the client I'm at, they actually do this really cool program where they help bring high schoolers in to the organization so they can kind of see what does it look like to work for a tech organization, and they can kind of get some professional experience. I think Brian and I are both Iowa State grads. They really push you in college to get that professional experience so that when, the job listing fresh out of college says we want 3 to 6 months of experience, like you're perfectly knocking it out of the park there. I think it'd be interesting just because of your professional career. How do you kind of approach mentoring multiple like interns or people of different levels of their career? Because I think that's something you've done kind of professionally for a while now.
Yeah, absolutely. First and foremost, I think the internship is a really good thing too, because in college, you're still trying to figure out, is this what I want to do for a living? And solving leak code problems isn't quite a fair representation of what it's like being an engineer, contrary to what recruiting says nowadays. But yeah, so how do you balance the levels? So when I'm working with interns or those new in their career, they don't know what they actually like to do yet. They're still figuring that out, right? Most of the time they already know how to code, but do they like front end? Do they like back end? Do they like digging deeper into the business and process side? Or are they more technical and they want to geek out on like really under the hood of computers and whatnot? So for me, I just spend some time figuring that out, asking them questions like, hey, what are the things that you like to do? And what are some things that you already know that you don't like to do? And that kind of helps me out. I think I may have used this analogy the last time I was on, but I kind of treat interns a little bit like an Eevee from Pokémon universe, that they have to be exposed to a little bit of everything to figure out what they actually want to be. So I kind of go from there. And then once I have an idea of this is the things I like, I then start kind of make sure that they have a foundation, right? So for example, if you're in the industry, you need to know source control. That's not debatable, right? That's been done and dusted. So a lot of companies use Git. That's why I typically start with is like, cool, let's start on making sure that you can create a PR, right? Can you create branches? Can you actually commit changes? And instead of giving these artificial, like, can you create a branch? I actually just drop them off into a really simple project, a code kata. I'm a huge fan of Mars Rover because it's got simple rules to pick up. It's just enough complexity that you can't just single line it, so it's a little more complicated in FizzBuzz, but not so complicated it takes you a week. But you have good natural cutouts for doing your PRs and all of that. And then based on how they code and solution that, I can kind of get an idea of their sense of style, right? So for example, engineers are really good, especially when they're starting out, on how to solve a problem, but maybe not in a very nice, neat, tidy way. So if I'm looking at their code and I see like, oh, there's a lot of duplication happening here, that makes me wonder, like, do you know design patterns? Or did you call it out in your own PR? Like, hey, this is duplicated. I don't know a great way of cleaning that up. Oh, you've already got like some good code sense going on there. Yeah. And then we kind of go from there. It's really easy though, when you're starting out with a bunch of interns, because it's all new. So you can kind of assume that. It can be a little bit trickier when like half your team is new and the other half are really experienced. Now, how do you get that to mingle together?
Yeah, it's really interesting you bring that up because like I think interns, there's a varying degree of expertise, right? Because like every internship I had, you'd have the guy who's like 1 semester away or 1 year away from graduating, and maybe he's been an intern since freshman year. So like they really know what they're doing. They know what to do at that company. Like they're basically a full-time employee or like are going to roll into a full-time gig as soon as they graduate and not miss a beat. Potentially even do, like I did work while in school, and literally like full-time was just I made an adult salary, but I was already on the same team, same project, same work. And then you have people who are like, this is their first exposure to professional coding, but like I feel like that end of the tech spectrum is a lot smaller than the super senior who's been doing this for 25 years and like can just like smash stuff out, no problem. How do you kind of help bridge that gap? You kind of hinted at that, but like I think we've all worked with the crotchety old guy who would rather just get the thing done than take the extra time to bring somebody else along. How do you help foster those relationships or help people see value in that instead of just, well, now that AI is around, let's not hire juniors. Let's just make Steve, the super senior, sling out 150% more code. And because he doesn't want to bring people along, we don't want to hire people, versus like saying, you know, like this is still valuable. We still need interns and juniors and, you know, keeping that pipeline and career path going.
Oh man. So there's like three really good questions in there. So I'm going to try to tease it out a little bit. So just because you have a team doesn't mean you're actually ready to bring on interns, first and foremost, right? If your team makeup is not conducive for learning, mentoring, and coaching, you cannot take on an intern, full stop. Because the last thing you want to do is bring someone in for an internship. They deal with a bunch of jerks and then they go back and realize, man, maybe I don't want to be an engineer. Maybe I'm not cut out for this. And if your first experience doing it like live is that, that's rough. That's really rough.
Can I add to that really quick? Interrupting you, sorry.
Yeah, get in here, Brian.
I want to add junior devs to that too, because I feel like there are teams that can't handle junior devs. Not even internships, but people they've hired full-time with the intent of bringing them up to speed, and then they just kind of throw them to the wolves and say, why aren't you getting this? So anyway, go ahead.
No, it's a good call out there. You can kind of think of bringing on interns or junior engineers as you're bringing a new plant into the garden. But if the soil's not right, the growing conditions aren't right, they're not going to thrive. They're not even going to survive, right? And that's just going to cause frustration for everyone. You as the leader, because now you got to deal with the friction. Your plants that were there before, right? They're frustrated because they're having to feel like they're bringing someone along. And then the people who just showed up, right? They're like, well, I was here to try to learn and do better, but none of y'all really want that. So that's my first piece of advice. If your environment's not conducive, then don't go forward, right? Don't go past go. Don't go collect $200. Your other question of super senior Steve and the like co-pilot AI lab. Well, I hate to say this, but mortality is a thing, right? Like engineers are going to age out of the industry, right? So if we're not taking the time to grow and foster that next generation, we're going to have a gulf here. Like that's going to happen, right? We already see it a little bit when we look at certain older technologies like COBOL engineers and Fortran engineers, right? You're not finding those a ton right now, right? And we didn't actively jeopardize that pipeline. When I see companies say like, oh, we don't need interns, we don't need associates, they're usually the same ones that go around like, well, why can't I find seniors? Well, you never grew them, right? You never really sowed the seeds to reap the harvest, if you will, there. And then your third question was essentially, how do you balance between super technical and super green, especially if they're even the same interns, right? Like from that same bit. Mm-hmm. What I like to do is like coach them, right? So if I've got an intern who said this is like their second or third year at this company, I'll have them take on coaching some of the interns, like the greener ones, right? Because they know what it's like to be an intern much more recently than me, right? I got my first internship experience back in 2010, right? Somebody who was an intern last summer or 2 summers ago are going to realize the lessons learned there a lot more effectively than me, right? So I'm going to give them that opportunity. And plus, let's face it, if you've done 3 summer internships and plus maybe doing some stuff on the side, you're getting really close to what we would have called a mid-level engineer anyway, because typically we say a mid-level somewhere between 1 to 2 years of experience. You're almost there already. And at that stage, you're expecting to have a little bit of leadership, a little bit of mentoring, a little bit of coaching. This is a great opportunity to do that. So that's kind of the way I would handle that. And for maybe my super senior intern who's mentoring the others, I'm checking in with them in our one-on-ones. Hey, how's it going coaching with this? Are there any concerns? Right. And I'm also kind of seeing a little bit of that, like, okay, this person's having trouble grokking this technical concept. How do you coach it? How do you train them? Right. So I'm kind of coaching the coach there a little bit, because as a leader, you're always trying to work yourself out of a job. So if I'm already telling someone, here's how you coach, cool, you can take on more of that, and I can kind of take a step back a little bit.
That's super interesting, because I feel like the companies that also say there's no seniors are the same companies that maybe try to hire a junior, and they're like, you know, juniors just aren't it for us. Because to your point, like, they planted a new seed in the garden, doesn't go well, depending on the size of your company, but it doesn't take much to, in that region, kind of soil your name at a university that maybe your team is recruiting out of, or, it only takes so many bad experiences that people just like don't want to work there anymore. And if you just start getting that compounding of, you hired somebody bad, their buddy, whether it's you or them, their buddy goes back to university, or like a recent grad tells their buddy or tells their friends, it just becomes this compounding cycle of being harder and harder to recruit, to the point that then their caliber of talent that they can get is objectively probably worse. So it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Like, you did bad with a good intern, it starts to soil your name. You get to the point where, hey, only people who are desperate are going to work there, and the desperate people aren't always the best caliber of talent. It's talking in generalities here too, not the rough job market we have today, just broad generalities. And then you just come to the conclusion that juniors or mids aren't right for you. But those people that, were juniors and mids now have that thought or that mind of your company. It's not, I have a super warm spot in the heart for the company that hired me out of college, Source Allies. They hired me as an intern. I learned a stupid amount of stuff so quickly, and I think it definitely wouldn't be where I was today, where I could have gone to, I don't know, picture a big enterprise company that doesn't really invest in their companies or in their people. You're just kind of a code monkey slinging code. That I could have been there, and however many years out of college we are now, been like maybe an SE2 or just having the conversation of maybe being a senior, but definitely not where I'm at now. And I think that is kind of the big differentiator here too, is you get that word of mouth of, hey, this is a great place to be if you want to grow technically. I mean, Lean Techniques is another great example, right? Until recently, I think 100% of our recruiting was all referral based. Like, we had more people telling their friends to come work here than we had jobs open. And until recently, where we've kind of exploded a little bit, like we haven't needed to actively recruit too hard. It's just been pure word of mouth of like, hey, now that we have a job open, my buddy should come work here. And like, there's not referrals, like people aren't making tons of money. It's just, hey, I want to work with my friend and there's cool stuff here, so I don't feel bad referring them. I think, and we also help grow talent, do all that sort of fun stuff too. It's just, I think some companies kind of miss that mark.
Your comment on growing talent is kind of critical, right? When I've worked with companies in the past who've needed an internship program and had one in the past and it didn't work out well, and I start chatting with them, it's like, cool, what'd you plan? They were going to show up. Cool, what else did you do? They were going to go join this team. All right, what else? That was it. So you were going to plop this new person into a team. Did anybody on that team ever interview this person? No. Okay, so you just plopped somebody in a team, hopefully that the personalities and all that worked out, and if not, well, sucks to suck. Okay, yeah, I can see why this maybe didn't go so well the first time around. When I generally work with companies, I like to kind of carve out a rough blueprint of here's what an internship's going to look like, right? So I'll pick on one of my most recent engagements. It was, all right, first week, you're going to get introduced to these type of people, like your product owners, fellow engineers, who actually make the company run, right, from a process perspective. You're also going to be doing a little bit of coding, right? Because as an intern, I assume that you know how to code something in some language. I have zero expectations that you know our tech stack, our technologies, or our process. So that first week, you're going to learn, like, here's how we do our pull requests. Here's how we set up a repo. Here's how we do these things. Here's how you get used to TypeScript, so on and so forth. After that, we go through the Mars Rover Kata, right? Because that's where we're going to talk about other practices like, here's how we set up a CI pipeline. Here's how we do our unit testing, that type of stuff. And then after that second week or so, we've already got a project lined up. And we try, the project is usually public facing, or it's going to be with a client, something like that. And it's complex enough that it will keep us busy somewhere between 2 to 4 weeks, right? Because we want there to be an actual end date in line, like, okay, we're going to be wrapping up here. And this is a great example of like, oh yeah, how do you go file new? How do you do user story mapping? How do you figure out what we need to build? How do you do all of that? And then for me, I'm kind of shifting more into an architect, like, hey, here's the technologies that I know we're going to have to use, right? Like, oh, we're an AWS company. We're hosting AWS. Guess what? This is going to be hosting AWS. And then right after we get done with that first project, that's kind of really provided some value, depending on the type of company, that kind of sets up the next bit. For example, my most recent engagement, I was working with a consultancy. So after we got through that first half, the second half was like, cool, now you're going to go to clients, work with some of our best clients, with some of our own people, so you see what it's like to be a consultant. Because here's the other trick I see companies miss the mark on. They bring the interns in and they give them this artificial environment for the entire internship, and then they leave and go, oh, this is awesome. Then they come back for a job and they realize, wait a minute, this is completely different. Well, yeah, of course, because you never let them actually do the job. You pretty much put them in a bubble, they succeed in the bubble, then you pop the bubble and go, well, why isn't this working anymore? Well, yeah.
Or I feel like you get an artificially awful experience because you'll be building like maybe some testing tool for a team that like is too lazy or doesn't really care about it enough to actually build it. And you're like, man, this place sucked. And you don't want to come back because you're like, if that's what it's like working here, and you know, the day-to-day job is probably entirely different. That's one thing I heard from a lot of people in school was they'd work at this big company, they'd build this testing tool that would test, you know, or make mock data for the production team to use, but they didn't get to touch real code. They didn't get to touch real things. It was like a weird side project that people didn't really pay attention to. And let's be frank, like in a lot of the cases, the company didn't care if it actually existed or not. Versus, I think, in comparison, like LT's great at this, Source Allies is great. I think there's a lot of companies where it's like, hey, we're going to put you on a real product team, and those people are going to actually be able to support you, but you'll get a real sense of day-to-day life. Because to your point, Cameron, I think you and I talked off screen about this. There's different types of engineers. There's the ones who get a real kick out of solving complex problems and just sit in code all day, every day. There's other engineers who'd rather learn the processes and sometimes optimize your workflow, even if that doesn't mean you're in the code. And I think some of those skills are kind of different depending on, you know, do you want to be a software consultant, a product engineer? Do you want to be a theoretical like person? Like all these different skills kind of play into different roles that you'd best excel at. And to your point, until you start trying them on, you might sit in an internship and think, I love this job, I hate this job. And if it's a totally different or encapsulated experience than what the real job's like, to your point, you hit the real world and then you have an identity crisis because you're like, man, I loved this internship, but I hate this company now. Or vice versa, right? Like, you're like, I really didn't like the internship. You're like, wow, this is great. Like, I wish I could have told everybody how awesome it is to work here because I had the exact opposite experience potentially. Like, and I think that's where maybe sometimes companies miss the mark too, is like they're a little bit cautious of interns or junior devs even too, right? Like I remember, I think it was month 4, another intern in my cohort force pushed to our Git repo a database migration and completely hosed our database in production.
Nice. Classic.
Like, you know, normal junior intern thing to do. Then we had a fire drill all afternoon while the full-time devs tried to restore the data. And then we had a little bit of an impromptu like, hey guys, Git force push, not something you should ever do unless there's very specific reasons. But in general, don't do that again. But then we got to see the ramifications, right? Like it's like the thing when people say they drop tables in production by mistake. It's like a mistake you only make once and then you're scared to death to ever do it again. And it's, you know, you learn better than just getting your hand slapped or something. You're like, hey, don't do that again. You're like, come on, it wasn't that big. It wouldn't be that big a deal, right? It's like, no, we saw the real ramifications. We saw the panic on everybody's eyes as prod just lost a bunch of data. Like, and then we had to, you know, see what happens when you have to email like, hey, prod's down for a little bit. All the sort of ramifications of that. So, you know, hey, in the future, I'm not going to Git force push unless I really know what I'm doing. And you wouldn't get that in a normal internship where nobody really cares about the product, right? It's like, oh, Bob just brought down the production database again. It's like, okay, whatever. We weren't going to use it again for another 3 weeks anyway. So just fix it by then. Like,
oh,
it doesn't get a real representation of the job.
Yeah, see, you're really hinting on something there. Making sure that your people have the right privileges, permissions to do the things that they're supposed to do. I've worked in places where interns got the same rights as like production engineers. I'm like, no, probably shouldn't do that. Right. Give them some training wheels first. But I've also worked at places where it was so locked down that they couldn't do anything. So you got to find that happy balance. Like my first internship, I absolutely took down an app because I was on a Linux box for the first time and I was trying to rename something and I RM'd instead of RN'd. Yeah. So, slick, really, really fun stuff there. And all of that goes because, and backing up a little bit, and the reason why it's so important that they work on stuff that's like the company cares about is because they want to actually work on something that people want to use, right? Think about it this way. You have spent time, whether that's going to get a degree, boot camp, whatever, but you've spent a substantial amount of time, energy, and possibly money to go work on cool stuff. And then what do you get to do? You get to do work that no one cares about, no one's ever going to see. That's pretty darn demoralizing, right? Like, yeah. Especially if that be your first thing out of the box. That's why when I work with companies, they think my end goal for any intern is by the end of the internship, you can actually show something to a friend of yours like, I helped build that.
Yeah.
I did that. In very rare instances, can you not do that? Usually it's when you're working with government and it's like, you can't talk about those things. But you can still be like, I help build this thing that helps accomplish these types of outcomes. You can still talk about it and be like, oh yeah, real people are using this.
My favorite example of that was when I was at Source Allies, Cheerland's website. They used to have like a booking website. I don't know if it's still there anymore. I should check. But the homepage, this guy really wanted a horizontal gradient for images that were cut across. So every time somebody would be like, oh, like what's something you've built before? I'm like, pull out your phone. It's like, you see that horizontal gradient? That was awful to make work on mobile and desktop because like the image had to cut and crop in a horizontal gradient. I was like, and here's how I figured out how to do that. Like it was a talking point. I could talk with recruiters, talk with like friends because it was a public website. It was something that like isn't super unique, but also isn't super common, right? Like it's like, oh, here's all the steps I did to solve this thing. And this was pre-AI, right? Like, but even with AI, you'll have to be messing with, oh, here's how I designed it so it worked on a phone too. Because if you just did percentages, I forget which way it was, but it was like, you know, you'd have this cool gradient on desktop and then mobile would be like straight up. So, or vice versa. It was either like super good on mobile and then extreme on desktop, but it's like, okay, and here's how I worked through that. And then you have a fun conversation piece that like isn't, here's what I did in college. Here's the, if you went to Iowa State, here's the Roomba project I did that literally everybody who goes through the computer engineering department has done. And it's, you know, again, a very small box. Literally everybody at the university's done it. It's not that cool when you think about it that way. Like it doesn't set you apart, I should say. It's cool, but it's like, hey, everybody who has that degree I know has done that. So
it's kind of interesting you mentioned the ability to talk about the project. So like when I'm interviewing, right, associate engineers, whatever, and they have like that technical thing that, hey, I put this on my resume because I can talk about it. I can tell pretty darn quickly if you actually did the work or not. And so being able to give interns that experience, like, oh yeah, I went and built the horizontal gradient thing, right? Well, let's take that for example. And we're talking about, I can see like, oh, you thought about these things. And when they mention like, oh yeah, I had to deal with like mobile versus desktop. Okay, so like there's some responsiveness there, right? Like I can kind of get a sense of how you thought about problems. And at that stage, associates and interns, once again, I'm not really focusing a ton on like what technical stuff you know. I'm really seeing more like, how do you think about problems? How do you approach problems, right? How do you level up? Because stuff's always changing, you know, all that. But if you're telling me like, oh yeah, well, I start breaking down the smaller parts, figure out which one I don't know the most and tackle that. Like, okay, cool. That's actually a reasonable engineering approach. I can work with that versus someone who, well, I take all of it and slam it into ChatGPT and whatever it spits me out, that's why I go with. Okay, cool. That works up to a point, but you need to actually understand what in the world you're doing there.
Yeah, that's something that I've been kind of waiting to talk about with you is just the idea of, you know, you mentioned it a minute ago, you know, a while back, but it's like, you know, I think of the typical intern experience of like the architect kind of says, here are the stubs, go write the code, right? So you have like, these are the functions that we need, go make this function work, right?
Mm-hmm.
But in today's day and age now, an intern or a junior dev even, handed that stub, could literally just plug it into Cursor or Codex or whatever they want to use, the tool of choice of the week, or just even put, you know, the question in the stub into ChatGPT and get an answer. Mm-hmm. Right. So now you've got no reasoning coming from this human anymore at all. Right. They just literally go get the answer, plug it in, they say, look, it works. And they feel like I've written this code and I've developed this thing. Now with Stack Overflow back in the day, you could do some similar things, but 90% of the time with Stack Overflow, it was never just plug and play. Like it didn't just work. You had to grab something, you had to research, you had to figure out why doesn't this work? You had to actually look at the code. But with ChatGPT, you literally can just say, here's my code. And you could pass off as a very successful intern now. Where do we start, like, challenging that? Like, how do we say, yeah, it's okay to, like, use ChatGPT to write a unit test for your code, or maybe that's even too much because maybe we want them to reason through what do I need to test, right? We want them to learn that logical thinking process that has to go into that, because otherwise we're going to become a fleet of people who can't do anything without ChatGPT to just, like, think for us. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, let me hop in there. So when I've worked with interns, especially with my most current crop, I encourage using tools like ChatGPT, Copilot, things like that. But funny enough, not necessarily for the code development, but for as another tool for like researching why something's not working. Like for example, I had an engineer who was trying to get like an NPM script to work and it wasn't working. And long story short is because they had forgotten the run keyword, right? So instead of like, because they saw that they could do NPM tests without it, so they had created a custom script, whatever. So they had done some research Googling and didn't come up with anything, and they went to ChatGPT, and it gave a pretty good description, like, oh yeah, custom script, you're going to need to put the word run in front of it, blah, blah, blah. To me, that's helpful, right? Because you are asking questions like, hey, this isn't working, let's go figure it out. I always stress the muscle memory. You got to get this stuff pounded into the hands, into the keyboard, right? Like that's how you learn this stuff. And I find that those tools to be great for reasoning or asking like, why would I do this over another? Or, hey, I'm getting this error message and it's not very clear why I would be getting this. What are some like things that you would think of? Okay, cool. And then that can spark some other additional conversations. I'm with you on the sense of if you just give them Copilot and say, go forth and do, bluntly, I don't really need you at that point, right? I didn't need an intern, right? That kind of defeats the whole purpose. So I think you're hinting at something where maybe we were even mistreating interns at the beginning where we said, hey, here's the stubs, go fill it in.
Right. Ooh,
right. So
that's
maybe
excellent.
So maybe that's like a process thing that now tools like AI have actually kind of sussed out for us that we need to be fixing.
That's a super interesting thought because I would have never put that together. But here's the other, like the second part of this. Like, so I can't tell you the number of times I've put something into ChatGPT and asked it to help me, and it thinks it's right. It thinks it has a solution, but it forgot something. That, for example, I was building some bicep files the other day, and I asked it to do some stuff to help me. I'm building out a workshop to secure web development. I'm doing a talk this summer at a couple different places, right? And I'm trying to get it ready. And it forgot to make a private endpoint to the web service once it had locked down the web service's public access and put a web app gateway in. And I, if I'm an intern, and I mean that's a more advanced scenario, but nothing I couldn't hand off. If I said, here's the stubs, go make it happen. Here's some documentation, like let's figure it out. And then whatever. ChatGPT thought it was right and totally left out one of the most critical pieces that it will never be able to communicate without this endpoint to be able to say, I need to do this. But as this, someone who's experienced that myself, having tried to build it on my own, I was able to say, don't you think you need a private endpoint? And like, oh yeah, of course I do. Blah, blah, blah. I see the problem. Was it the shirt that Kevin Griffin wants? Is I see the issue now or something like that. I see what the issue is, or
yeah.
So I can't remember what the exact phrasing is, but we've all seen it 100 times.
On that note, though, right? So let's say it was me in there. Let's say I would have built it out, right? And I try to make it work, and it doesn't work because, like you said, the private endpoint's out there. What do? I iterate. Okay, cool. Hey, I'm getting this error message saying that's not available, and then it would probably most likely go like, oh, hey, did you check to see if you've got a private endpoint? Would probably be one of its troubleshooting steps.
Sure.
So I find that sometimes you have to get in that iterative loop, which to me is not terribly different than what we used to do in the past. Like, hey, I found this thing on Stack Overflow, try to make that work.
Sure.
Okay, I got a little bit closer, but now I'm getting a different error message. What would you do? You go right back to Stack Overflow. Now look at the next set.
Yeah. So the difference for me here, because I agree with you 100%, the iteration part is extremely valuable. It is, and I'm actually trying to figure out, well, how can we use this to make people learn better? Kind of like what we're sussing out here. I can't believe I just said that. Dang it. Anyway, so the idea of having this tool to help us learn, help us grow, the iteration, the difference between, for me at least, between a Stack Overflow iteration cycle and a ChatGPT cycle is like, I feel like when I did it through Stack Overflow, I was more involved in the decision making. I had to figure things out. I'm going to remember those problems better. ChatGPT, I said, hey, something's wrong. It said, oh yeah, it's this. Okay, go plug that in. It doesn't work. Okay, it doesn't work yet. Okay, try this. 6 things later, you finally get it to work. You're like, great, that's awesome. It works. But you don't remember that problem the same way as if you had tried things yourself, plugged the code in yourself, gone to Stack Overflow or whatever, gotten a sample, tweaked it so it fit your solution, worked it, melded it into your stuff, tried it, and it didn't work. And you're like, well, maybe it's this line of code. Maybe it's this line of code, so you're spending more time looking at each line of code. ChatGPT is just like, just fix this, just do this, try this, replace that, and all of a sudden it works, and you're like, great, it's golden. But I just don't feel like like you said, the muscle memory of doing it is, well, I'm plugging and playing, but I'm not actually having to deeply evaluate what's happening like I do if I'm doing it on my own. Does that make sense?
I think it does.
I think the iteration's too fast. You don't have enough time to actually sit, read through the error message and figure it out because you most likely just, plug, especially if you're using like an IDE and integrated, right? It can just self do that.
Right.
Yeah, I think there's some truth there. This is where it's going to sound bad. I wish I could kind of put away my experience and try to learn programming from scratch in like in year 2025 and say like what patterns happen there, because this tooling hasn't been around long enough yet for someone to have actually only been raised on that tool. Right. And so because of that, I don't know what the shortcomings are. That's kind of my point there is I'd be really curious to see how that's going to evolve. Like, for example, we now have mid engineers who've only been able to use tools like ChatGPT. How do they approach coding? What does that even look like then? We don't know yet.
I also have a hot take that AI will not make a bad engineer good. It just might hide how bad they are. And the reason I say that is you brought up Stack Overflow. There was somebody I worked with at one point who was making a career change and loved W3 schools and would always just copy and paste those examples into our code base. And there was multiple occasions in pull request reviews we had to say, why do we have CSS of pizza toppings?
Nice.
Why do we have CSS that's just not being used? Why? And like, this was a common theme that never seemed to really improve. And I think you have the distinction there of people who are in it for the profession and people who are in it for the paycheck. Where AI might potentially be able to hide it a little bit, you're just going to always have people that just do the shortest answer. And if it works, cool, ship it and move on. And then you have people who like treat it with maybe a little bit more level of professionalism of like, hey, it's also like the person who is not technical and talked about how they created a startup built totally just using AI. And then people started injecting in keys to their database and running scripts with their database data. Just by not sanitizing their input because AI didn't do that for them. I think it's the same
to ask
thing.
That question. They didn't see the missing piece because it worked, but they didn't have to evaluate it mentally to say, well, is everything there?
And I think that is the same for Stack Overflow too, right? Like, hey, my error went away. I tweaked it just enough and I'm going to move on. I didn't understand what I was doing was wrong. That totally could happen too.
Sure.
I'll give you credit. The agent feature where it just shoves it into your code and renames everything for you totally makes that easier to do. I think it's just a matter of, the same way you shouldn't just copy and paste from Stack Overflow, you shouldn't just plug in what the agent gives you. You should give it a little bit more thought, potentially.
Well, I'm also going to put this out there. We're talking about like SQL injection, right? Let's be very clear. And, Brian, you mentioned like, oh, they didn't even know that was a thing.
Right.
Well, how did we first come across this, right? Experience, right? We get bit in the butt. I think that's still going to be a critical part. Right. That even if you do use these tools, your point of it doesn't make a bad engineer good is an interesting one because I think in some cases it can. I think what AI tools are doing is it's actually making the art of having to write code not be as big of a deal because I don't have to artisanally handcraft every line. I don't have to artisanally handcraft every object, design pattern, whatnot, because for the most part, especially for product engineering, the code was always a byproduct. In an ideal world, we wouldn't even had to write the code. We just had to get the thing working. So then it becomes, well, then like, why do we care about the code so much? Well, because we have to maintain it. And if the code's a mess, it's harder to maintain. Well, if it's easy, if the time of maintenance now is no longer scaling based on that, right? If a crappy code base is just as fast to maintain as a good code base with using tools like that, does that matter anymore? For me, it does. Because I know because my name's attached to it, right? If this breaks or goes, haywire, I've got to go fix it. But if I'm vibe coding my way through this, or I'm using other tools to kind of help reflect that, I may not care as much.
And I think that's a great point too. Like the reason XP programming or extreme programming even is a thing is because they found out through studies that writing tests reduced production outages, had higher code quality. So when stuff did break, it was easier to find. Like it was a byproduct of production being down so much that people started doing testing and doing automated testing. That mixed with like computers could do more, but it was mostly the production outages. And now you even have tools like Dora, right, that are measuring just your uptime or mean time to getting back up. All those kind of measurements that are out there. I think to your point, Cameron, if we get 100% uptime and no security vulnerabilities with vibe code, testing might go out the window. I don't think we'll ever get there, so we'll still be testing.
Did you just say something that was music to my ears? You might have.
You don't have to write tests anymore, Brian? Is that what you're...
That would be amazing.
Well, and and I think that's kind of the kernel of all of it, right? Is we've got this new tooling. We're still at the figuring out stage of what can it do? What should it be doing? right? I even said what it should be doing. We're not even there yet. We're still trying to figure out like, what can it do, period. Then we're going to narrow it down to like, okay, it can do all these things, but what should it be doing? And that's just how the industry is right now. Right. Cause every time I look around, like MCP, right? Was that Model Context Protocol? I think that's what it stands for. Yeah. Now you're letting agents actually be able to give it custom actions to do, right? Okay. That's awesome. Should you, so a little bit of history, right? Most of my background's in healthcare, right? Like that's where I got my chops in. So that's why I think about things is from like a medical station. Okay, cool. Should you allow that to automatically do things to like a medical device? Probably not, but could you with MCP? Absolutely. If there's an API you can tie into it, you absolutely can do that. But we've not even got to that stage yet of essentially saying like, yeah, that's probably a bad idea.
That's
and so that's the art, right? The art hasn't come in yet.
They spent so much time wondering if they could do it, they didn't stop to think if they should.
Correct.
Little Jurassic Park quote for you.
I think that's a great quote to end off on where we are right now. Cameron, any last shout outs? How can people follow along with you in your journey? If they want to learn how to tame tech, all that sort of fun stuff.
You can find me on BlueSky at the Software Mentor. That's my handle there. And you can always follow along at my blog at blog.softwarementor.com.
Awesome. Thanks for chatting with us. And thanks everybody for tuning in. We'll see everybody else in a month or a week. And it depends. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, y'all.